Let her sit with the kids. My dad said, his tone casual, dismissive, as if he were deciding where to place the extra napkins. My brother laughed. His new girlfriend covered her mouth to hide a smirk, and I, 28 years old, head of a growing tech firm, supposedly a grown woman, was handed a red plastic chair next to my 8-year-old niece. The clatter of silverware, the jingling of Christmas music, the smell of turkey and pine, it all blurred together while my father's words echoed. She doesn't run anything anyway. They had no idea that in less than 24 hours they'd see my face on the Forbes holiday issue. Christmas Eve had always been sacred in the Harrison household, or at least that's how it used to feel. The house was the same warm lights draped over the roof, the scent of cinnamon rolls wafting from the kitchen, the sound of Bing Crosby looping in the background, but the people inside had changed. My father, Richard Harrison, once the kind of man whose laughter filled a room, had turned into someone who measured worth by profit margins. My brother Paul inherited his confidence and his entitlement while I'd been quietly building something they didn't understand. When I walked in that night, snow still clinging to my coat, Mom greeted me with the same practiced cheer she used for neighbors and mailmen. "Emma, honey, you made it. Take your coat off, dinner's almost ready." "Thanks, Mom." I hung my coat by the door, scanning the familiar living room. Same oak furniture, same family photos, except the new one, Paul shaking hands with a real estate mogul at some company gala. I wasn't in a single frame. Paul strolled in from the dining room, champagne in hand. "Well, if it isn't the prodigal techie." "Are you still doing that computer thing? Still doing that?" I said lightly. "We just signed our biggest contract yet." He smirked. "Oh yeah, that little project of yours still running." "It's not little," I replied, keeping my tone even. "Lumina Systems now manages supply chains for 5 national clients." "Supply chains," he repeated as if tasting the phrase and finding it bland. "Sounds complicated." "Dad, did you hear Emma's still doing her computer thing?" From across the table, my father's voice carried amused and dismissive. "That's nice, sweetheart. Grab a seat, we're about to start." When I reached the dining table, my smile froze. The long mahogany table gleamed with wine glasses and gold-trimmed plates. At one end sat my father and Paul, surrounded by their business partners. At the far end, by the kitchen doorway, stood a smaller table, bright red plastic chairs, paper napkins folded into uneven triangles. "Where am I sitting?" I asked. Mom's voice faltered. "We had to add some people last minute. You don't mind sitting with the kids, do you? Just for tonight?" Paul grinned. "It's fitting, isn't it? Our little Emma, the family genius, is back where she started." For a second, I thought it was a joke. Then I saw the empty red chair next to my niece, the crayons scattered across the table, the gingerbread house half finished. The laughter and conversation from the adult table grew louder, filling the silence that had settled around me. I sat down without a word. My niece smiled up at me, gap-toothed and sweet. "Auntie Emma want to help me finish the candy roof?" I managed a smile. "Sure, sweetheart." Across the room, my father raised his glass. "To family," he said, his voice rich and commanding. "And to Paul, who's stepping up to manage our biggest partnership yet." They toasted. The clinking of crystal glasses sounded like applause for a play I was never cast in. I remembered every time I tried to share my milestones, a feature in a local business journal, the moment we reached our first million in revenue, the day I hired my 10th employee. My father's responses were always the same. "That's nice, dear. Good for you. When are you going to get a real office?" They thought Lumina was a hobby. They thought I was still the quiet kid who built robots in the garage, while they talked football stats and profit charts. But what they didn't know, what they never bothered to ask, was that Lumina had just closed a multi-million-dollar deal with Langford Interiors, one of the very companies my father's construction business relied on. My software now powered their logistics, their finances, their operations. In a way, I was already inside my father's empire. He just didn't know he was sitting on my system. Dinner blurred into background noise. I watched as Paul bragged about his new car, as Dad told the same stories about his business instincts. Every so often, Mom's eyes would flick toward me, soft with guilt, but she never said a word. When dessert came out, Dad called down to the table. "Emma, are you still there? Are the kids done eating yet?" Something inside me shifted, not anger, not sadness, but something sharper, quieter. I smiled. "Yeah, Dad, we're done here." That night when I got home, I placed my phone on the counter, wiped off my lipstick, and saw the unread email that had come in while I was at dinner. Subject: Forbes, holiday issue. Final proof for approval. Body, please confirm you're satisfied with your cover and feature title. The woman who rewired American supply chains. I stared at my reflection in the dark window, the faint glow of Christmas lights flickering across the glass. My father had given me a seat at the kids' table. Tomorrow morning he'd open the paper and see my face under the headline that would change everything. He'd finally realize I'd been running more than he ever imagined. When I was little, I used to think my father's voice was the sound of certainty itself. When he spoke, everyone listened. Even my teachers at school treated Richard Harrison's daughter like it meant something. I grew up believing success came with a handshake and a heavy watch. Back then, I didn't realize those same hands that built a business could just as easily push you aside when you stopped fitting the picture. In our house, achievement wasn't about effort. It was about belonging. And I'd stopped belonging the day I chose code over concrete. The Harrison family empire began long before I was born. My grandfather Thomas had started Harrison Homeworks, a local construction company that grew into a regional powerhouse during the housing boom. By the time my father took over, the business was synonymous with respectability, solid, dependable, full-page ads in every Denver magazine. Our name was printed on trucks, banners, and blueprints. But somewhere between legacy and loyalty, love got lost in translation. Growing up, Paul and I were treated like heirs to a small kingdom. Every Christmas, Dad would seat us at opposite ends of the dining table and say, "One day, everything you see will be yours." He always looked at Paul when he said "you." Paul was the perfect son for the job. Tall, confident, quick with a joke, he carried the Harrison charm like an heirloom. He could talk anyone into anything, and Dad adored it. I was quiet, awkward, obsessed with puzzles and computers. When other kids built tree houses, I was building code. I remembered one summer Paul won a regional golf tournament and Dad threw a party that filled the house. That same week, I won a national high school competition for designing an automated inventory system. Dad just nodded and asked, "That's nice, sweetheart. Did you get any real money for it?" At first, Dad humored it. He'd ruffle my hair and say, "That's cute, sweetheart. But don't spend too much time with that screen. Real success happens in the field." But as years passed, his tolerance turned to impatience. When Paul joined the company after college, Dad threw him a welcome dinner with banners and champagne. When I got my first job at a small tech startup, he sent a text, "Congrats. Don't forget to call your mother." By the time I founded Lumina Systems, I'd already stopped expecting applause. Lumina was born out of frustration, mine and everyone's, who'd ever watched good companies collapse under bad systems. I designed software that could predict supply chain breakdowns before they happened. It was precise, efficient, and scalable. I worked 16-hour days from my apartment, fueled by caffeine and stubbornness. When we signed our first real client, I thought maybe Dad would see me differently. He didn't. During one phone call, I told him we'd hit our first $1 million in annual revenue. He laughed. "That's cute, Emma. 1 million barely buys lumber these days." I learned then that no number would ever impress him unless it started with his name. I stopped measuring my worth by his reaction and started measuring it by my results. Last year, when Lumina partnered with Langford Interiors, a national real estate firm, it felt like a full-circle moment. Langford relied on Harrison Homeworks for construction, which meant our software was running the logistics for both sides of their supply chain. Without knowing it, Dad's business depended on mine. That irony became my secret armor. The night after the Christmas dinner, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying his voice, "Let her sit with the kids." I told myself it didn't matter, but it did. Not because I wanted validation, but because somewhere deep down, I still wanted to believe that family could be proud of you without understanding you. By morning, my phone was buzzing. Paul had texted big day for Dad's project Langford deal finally confirmed. Try not to gloat about your tech stuff at dinner tonight. He's stressed. The text itself was a subtle reminder, my project is important. Yours is just tech stuff. I smiled bitterly. If only he knew. An hour later, I was standing in Lumina's downtown office, a sleek space of glass walls and quiet efficiency. My assistant, Nora, walked in holding 2 coffees. You've seen it. I nodded. The Forbes holiday issue lay open on my desk, my face smiling up from the glossy cover. Headline, The Woman Who Rewired American Supply Chains. Congratulations, boss, Nora said. You've been trending since 5 a.m. Thanks, I said softly. Has Langford called? They confirmed the rollouts ahead of schedule. Their CEO's thrilled. Oh, and Harrison Homeworks just sent another data request through your system. They're still using your algorithms to manage the logistics of the very partnership Paul is celebrating. I looked out the window down at the frozen city. The irony was exquisite. My father's empire was running on my algorithms while he still thought I was playing with code. Later that morning, my phone rang again, my mother. Emma, are you coming by for Christmas lunch today? She asked. Your father wants to talk to you about something. He's in good spirits. Sure, I said. What about? Oh, just business, I think. You know how he is. I almost laughed. He had no idea. When I arrived at the house that afternoon, the dining table was already set, the adult table this time. Paul was pouring wine. Mom was fussing over the ham, and Dad stood at the head of the table, hands on his hips, like a general reviewing his troops. Emma, he greeted, smiling thinly. Glad you could make it. We've got something to celebrate. What's that, I asked? The Langford expansion, he said proudly. They're crediting us with record efficiency this quarter. Our new system's saving them millions. I bit the inside of my cheek to stop the smile. Your new system? Yeah. Some tech thing they installed recently. Langford says it's a game changer. Maybe one day you'll build something like that. The room laughed politely. I raised my glass. Maybe one day. As we toasted, my phone buzzed in my pocket, a message from Langford's CEO. Congratulations on the Forbes cover, Emma. Couldn't think of a better face to represent our success. I looked at my father, still basking in the glow of his own speech, and thought, one day starts today. The funny thing about family business is that no matter how much you try to keep things separate, they always find a way to collide. I had spent years building a world where my last name didn't open or close doors for me, and now somehow my company had become the backbone of the one that never believed I'd make it. The irony wasn't lost on me. Harrison Homeworks. My father's pride and joy was running on Lumina's software without realizing it. My name might not have been on his blueprints, but every one of his projects was powered by my code. The partnership had happened quietly. Langford Interiors had reached out to Lumina, desperate for a more efficient supply chain management system. Their operations were massive, and they'd found Lumina through a tech conference in Seattle. As the contract expanded, the overlap with my father's business became impossible to ignore. Now every invoice my father approved, every order his team processed it all, ran through Lumina's system. My system. I could have told him, but I didn't, because part of me needed him to see it for himself, to recognize it without my help. That morning I stood in the glass-walled conference room of Lumina HQ, staring at the city skyline as my operations manager, Nora, ran through the final metrics. The Langford integration is complete, she said, scrolling through her tablet. And you'll want to see this, their contractor data. She handed me the screen. There it was in black and white. Primary subcontractor, Harrison Homeworks, Denver Division. I exhaled slowly. How's their performance score? Average, Nora said carefully. They've had some delays in material procurement, but thanks to Lumina's system, the losses were minimal. You kind of saved them without meaning to. I smiled faintly. That's the story of my life. A tremor ran through me, a strange mix of vindication and regret. Seeing Harrison Homeworks listed under a contract I signed was like looking at a hidden vulnerability in the armor I'd spent 2 decades trying to penetrate. I remembered all those Christmases when Dad would talk about the supply chain, like it was an arcane ritual only he understood. Now I was the one pulling all the levers. Minimal losses, I murmured. That meant my system had shielded their inefficiency. I wasn't just building my own company. I was inadvertently protecting him. I felt a cold sadness. I hadn't wanted revenge. I had just wanted recognition. But even in this success, I was merely the unnamed rescuer to his empire. The following week, Langford's CEO, Michael Langford, invited me to lunch at a private restaurant downtown. "Emma," he said, shaking my hand, "I read your Forbes profile. Impressive stuff. You know our construction partners are singing your praises, especially Harrison Homeworks." I froze for half a second before recovering. "Are they?" "Oh, yes," he said, leaning back. "Their CEO, Richard Harrison. Your father, right?" I gave a small nod. He smiled knowingly. "He's a hard man to impress. You've done what few people can, made him efficient." I laughed softly, though my stomach twisted. "He doesn't know it's me." Langford raised an eyebrow. "You're joking." "I wish I were." "Well," he said, lifting his glass, "when he finds out, I hope I'm in the room. That's a reaction worth seeing." It was strange hearing my father's name in someone else's mouth, especially spoken with respect that should have been mine. For years I'd chased his approval like a paycheck I could never cash. And here I was, being congratulated for quietly running his success in the background. When I got home that evening, I opened my laptop and scrolled through Lumina's internal dashboard. Harrison Homeworks data filled the screen: shipments, invoices, productivity metrics. My father's company was thriving under my system. It felt surreal. Then a message popped up in the team chat: Langford requesting a photo of Lumina's executive team for PR purposes. My stomach tightened. That meant press coverage. Exposure. I typed quickly, "Approve the release. Full transparency." If my father was going to find out, it would be from the world, not from me. The next morning, the Langford Lumina partnership announcement went live. It was everywhere: LinkedIn, industry journals, trade news. The headline read, "Langford Interiors partners with Lumina Systems for global expansion." The press release listed both client and subcontractor names. Under key partners, Harrison Homeworks. By noon, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Journalists, investors, even old classmates I hadn't spoken to in years. But one message stopped me cold. It was from my mother. "Emma, your father just saw the article. He's asking questions. Please call him." I stared at the text for a long time before replying. Not yet. That night, snow began to fall again, soft, quiet, almost cinematic. I watched it from my apartment window, the city lights blurring through the glass. Somewhere across town, my father was probably sitting in his leather chair reading that same article as trying to understand how his daughter's name ended up next to his company's. I wondered if he felt proud or betrayed. Then I remembered his voice from Christmas Eve, sharp and casual. "She doesn't run anything." And for the first time in years, I didn't feel angry. I just felt done waiting. I opened my laptop, logged into Lumina's executive dashboard, and sent a message to Langford's PR team. Subject: follow-up interview body. "I'll do the interview. On camera. And yes, I'll mention the family connection." It was time for my father to see exactly what I'd been running. The studio lights were blinding, but I didn't blink. I'd been through worse boardrooms filled with condescension, dinner tables lined with doubt. Cameras were easy. The producer counted down from 3, and when the red light blinked on, I smiled. "I'm Emma Harrison, founder and CEO of Lumina Systems." I began calm, composed, deliberate. "We build technology that connects industries and people through transparency and trust." The words came naturally, polished through years of having to prove I belonged. What I didn't say not yet was that the same system had just saved my father's company. The Forbes holiday special wasn't my first interview, but it was the one that mattered most. The host, a woman named Kelly Ramos, leaned forward with a practiced smile. "Emma, your company has grown remarkably fast. Lumina is now a key partner for several major construction and design firms, including Langford Interiors. What's the secret to your success?" "Resilience," I said, and remembering that being underestimated can be a powerful motivator. Kelly's eyebrows lifted slightly. Underestimated by whom? I smiled faintly. Family, colleagues, the world? Take your pick. The crew chuckled quietly. I didn't. What I wanted to say was that being invisible to the people who should have believed in me first had taught me how to be undeniable to everyone else. But instead, I said, sometimes you have to stop waiting for permission to be seen. Wise words, Kelly said, shuffling her cards. There's a personal story behind that, isn't there? I met her gaze and nodded. There always is. We moved through the questions about innovation, leadership, the future of tech. When the cameras cut, Kelly leaned closer. That line will resonate, she said softly. We all have someone we needed to prove wrong. I smiled politely. I didn't need to prove him wrong, I said. I just needed to stop letting him define what right looked like. An hour later, I was back in my office downtown Heels, clicking against the marble floor. Nora looked up from her desk. They just posted the teaser clip. You're trending again. I raised an eyebrow. Already? She turned her screen toward me. There I was, mid-sentence, the caption reading, "Sometimes being underestimated is the best thing that can happen to you. Emma Harrison, Lumina Systems CEO." Below that, the hashtags, Women in Tech, Forbes, Holiday Family Business. I exhaled slowly. The algorithm had found its next story. Within hours, my inbox flooded. Congratulations from peers, inquiries from investors, and one message that stopped my heart cold. Subject: You could have told me. From Richard Harrison. I didn't open it right away. I just stared at the sender's name. Finally, I clicked. Emma saw your interview. Impressive work. I didn't realize Lumina was behind the Langford system. Seems you've done well for yourself. Would have appreciated hearing it from you instead of from a journalist. Dad. No warmth. No apology. But the word impressive was there, a flicker of acknowledgement I hadn't expected. I typed a response, deleted it, and typed again. Finally, I settled on, you never asked. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept picturing his face the moment recognition must have hit the pride. He wouldn't let himself feel the discomfort of realizing I'd succeeded outside his blueprint. The next morning, Paul called. So he began, voice tight. Dad's been in a mood since your little TV moment. What exactly are you trying to prove? Nothing. I just told the truth. He scoffed. You made him look like an idiot. Everyone's talking about how his company's dependent on yours. He feels blindsided. Maybe because he didn't care enough to ask, I said evenly. I ensured his business didn't collapse. He should feel grateful, not blindsided. There was silence on the other end. Then quieter. You always have to make it about you, Paul. I said, my voice low now, steady. It's not about me. It's about finally being seen. If that makes you uncomfortable, maybe you should ask yourself why. He hung up. I sat in my office, the city spread out below me. I thought about how strange success feels when there's no one left you need to prove it to. It's quieter, colder, but it's yours. By noon, the Forbes team called again. They wanted to feature Lumina on the magazine's holiday issue cover, front page, full spread. My pulse quickened. When I asked, tomorrow morning. We're printing at dawn. After we hung up, I stared at my reflection in the window. My father had given me a seat at the kids' table because he thought I didn't run anything. Tomorrow the world would know otherwise. That night I sent him one last email. Dad, tomorrow morning pick up the new issue of Forbes. You'll understand everything then. Love, Emma. I hit send. The issue hit the shelves at dawn, and by breakfast my face was everywhere on newsstands, in lobbies, in the hands of people who had once brushed past me like I was invisible. Forbes holiday issue. The headline glowed in gold: Emma Harrison, the architect of tomorrow's supply chains. Below it, my portrait, calm, confident eyes straight into the camera. It was surreal seeing my name elevated to a brand. But the real satisfaction came later when my father's secretary called Lumina's front desk at 9:15 in the morning asking for a Ms. Harrison. She had no idea which one she was about to reach. I was in a board meeting when Nora slipped me a note. Your father's office on line 1, it read. Her eyes said everything, half warning, half thrill. I nodded slightly. Tell him I'll call back at 10. Truth was, I wanted him to sit with it, to read the article, cover to cover, to see the photo of me standing in front of Lumina's data center, arms crossed, headline above my head. Her software powers America's biggest builders, including her own family. By 10, my phone rang again. This time it wasn't his assistant. It was him. Emma. His voice was low-clipped, careful. Got a few minutes, I do, I said, matching his tone. I saw the magazine. I figured you would. A pause stretched heavy and uncertain. Then, why didn't you tell me? Tell you what? That I built something without your permission, he exhaled sharply. You know that's not what I meant. Then what did you mean? Dad, another pause. You blindsided me. That article makes it sound like Harrison Homeworks runs on your system. It does, I said simply. The silence that followed felt like the first true moment of honesty between us. I don't like surprises, he finally muttered. I know, I said. That's why I didn't tell you. You would have turned it into an argument instead of a conversation. He didn't deny it. You should have come to me, he said instead. We could have worked together, made it official. You mean you could have taken credit, I replied. His sigh crackled through the phone. You've always misunderstood me, Emma. No, I said quietly. I think I finally understand you perfectly. I hung up before he could respond. The next few hours were chaos in slow motion. Forbes had tagged Lumina in every post, and by noon our servers were buckling under the spike in traffic. News outlets started picking up the story. Tech CEO's family didn't know she ran the system powering their business. Reporters called it poetic. Some called it payback. At lunch I sat alone in my office watching the headlines multiply. Paul called just after 1. His voice was sharp, strained. What the hell, Emma? Dad's furious. Do you know what you've done? Built something that works? You made us look stupid, he snapped. He's getting calls from clients asking if you run the company now. I leaned back in my chair, smiling faintly. Maybe that's a question worth asking. Don't get smug, Paul warned. You might have your moment, but Dad built that empire long before you learned to code. And yet here we are, I said softly, his empire running on my algorithms. There was a long silence before he hung up. By 3, my inbox was full of congratulations from people who'd once ignored me, mentors, who'd passed on me for promotions, former classmates who'd laughed at my startup dreams, even a few investors who'd rejected my pitch years ago. They all wanted to reconnect, to discuss synergies. Funny how visibility changes everything. Around 5 o'clock, Nora poked her head into my office. You might want to see this. She held out her tablet. On it was a photo my father standing in his office, Forbes magazine in hand. Someone from his staff had snapped it and posted it to social media with the caption, "When the student becomes the architect." He's not going to like that, I murmured. Too late, Nora said. It's trending under Forbes family. That night I drove past the Harrison headquarters, the old brick building that had defined my childhood. Through the glass facade I could see the lights still burning in his office. For a moment I imagined him sitting there, the magazine open on his desk, finally realizing the full weight of what he'd dismissed. The man who once said, "She doesn't run anything," was now running on everything I'd built. I parked across the street, turned off the engine, and let the quiet fill the car. The truth was, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt hollow. The victory was sharp-edged, almost painful. For years I dreamed of the moment my father would see me not as his daughter, not as a hobbyist, but as an equal. Now that it had happened, there was no joy in it. He'd see the truth, but he'd never say it. The next morning, Forbes released a behind-the-scenes video from the interview. It opened with me saying, "Sometimes being underestimated isn't an obstacle. It's fuel." In the background, my father's company logo flashed briefly on a screen. By noon, the phone in his office would ring nonstop. Investors, journalists, partners, all asking the same question, "Did you know your daughter's the one who built your system?" For once, I didn't care about his answer, because the truth was already printed in black gold and undeniable ink. By Christmas morning, the silence in my parents' house was louder than any argument we'd ever had. The tree still glittered with white lights. Gifts still sat wrapped beneath it, but something invisible had cracked. My mother's hands shook slightly as she poured coffee, and Paul's girlfriend kept her eyes glued to her phone. The Forbes holiday issue sat in the center of the table like an uninvited guest, its glossy cover catching the light with every awkward shift. My father hadn't said a word to me since the article dropped, but the way he looked at me said enough. He sat at the head of the table, jaw tight, the magazine folded neatly beside his plate. "We'll eat," he said flatly. "Then we'll talk." Mom tried to smile to fill the space between us with warmth, but it wilted under the tension. "Emma, sweetheart, you look lovely. That's a beautiful coat." "Thanks, Mom." Paul cleared his throat. "So Forbes, huh? Big deal." I met his eyes. "It is." The clink of silverware filled the silence. No one mentioned that my face was on the cover, or that my company's name was now synonymous with the family's business success. My father ate mechanically, eyes fixed on his plate. Halfway through breakfast, he set his fork down. "Let's talk." Paul froze mid-bite. Mom's hand twitched toward her coffee. Dad turned to me. "You embarrassed me. By succeeding, by blindsiding me," he snapped. "Do you have any idea how many calls I've taken in the last 24 hours? Clients asking if I'm working for you. Journalists implying my company couldn't function without yours." I kept my tone even. "That's not an implication. That's data. Your efficiency scores are the highest they've been in a decade thanks to Lumina." Mom spoke softly, trying to bridge the gap. "Richard, she's not wrong. You've said to yourself how much easier things have been lately." "That's not the point," he said sharply. She went behind my back. "I didn't," I said. "You never looked forward, Dad. You never asked about the contract that would ultimately secure your stability." For a second, no one breathed. Paul muttered, "Here we go." Dad turned to him. "You stay out of this, then back to me. You could have come to me. You could have told me what you were doing. And you would have listened," I asked. "The last time I told you about a contract, you said my company wasn't real. You said tech wasn't tangible, that it wouldn't last. That was before you decided to use it against me." "I didn't use anything against you," I said, voice low. "I built something that worked, and it happened to help you. You're welcome." He stared at me for a long moment. Then almost bitterly, "Is this revenge?" The word landed like glass shattering between us. I didn't flinch. "No, Dad. It's visibility. It's me refusing to be defined by your lack of belief." He looked away, the muscles in his jaw twitching. "You wanted to prove something. I wanted you to see something," I said. "That the little girl you dismissed built something powerful. That your name isn't the only one that matters." For the first time, his voice faltered. "I never meant to make you feel small." "You didn't have to mean it," I said. "You just had to do it." The room was still. Snow drifted against the window. Mom stood finally, her voice trembling. "That's enough. It's Christmas." I rose from my chair, pushing it in carefully. "You're right. It is." I looked at my father one last time. "Merry Christmas, Dad." He didn't reply. I left the house without looking back. Outside, the cold hit like clarity. My breath fogged in the air as I walked to my car. I could see my reflection in the frosted window, steady, unbroken, finally my own person. When I slid into the driver's seat, my phone buzzed. A message from the Forbes editor. The feature's breaking records. "We'd like to schedule a follow-up on women changing legacy industries." Interested, I stared at the message, then at the faint outline of my father's house in the rearview mirror. "Yes," I whispered, typing the word back. "Let's do it." I started the engine. Power changes the temperature of a room. I could feel it the moment I walked into the Langford headquarters 3 days after Christmas. The air was sharper, filled with curiosity and calculation. The Forbes cover had turned my name into currency, and suddenly everyone wanted to trade in it. My company didn't just partner with Langford anymore, it powered them. Michael Langford met me in the executive suite overlooking the frozen city skyline. His handshake was firm, his grin too wide. "Emma," he said, "you've had quite a week." "Something like that," I replied, taking the seat across from him. He gestured toward the Forbes magazine sitting on the table. You made us look good. Our investors are thrilled. Efficiency's up 20% this quarter. That's what Lumina was designed to do. And it's working better than we ever imagined, he said. Which brings me to why I wanted to see you today. He leaned forward, folding his hands. We want to buy Lumina. I blinked. Excuse me, not absorb it, he clarified quickly. Acquire it outright. Keep you as CEO, of course. We'd integrate Lumina as our technology division. Full resources, unlimited budget. We can get you into Asia and Europe within 6 months, Emma. Scale you instantly. This isn't just an acquisition. It's a fast track to global dominance. I sat back, letting his words hang in the air. And my independence? He smiled the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. You'd be free to run operations. But ownership, well, that would fall under the Langford umbrella. There it was. The same voice I'd grown up hearing from boardroom doors and dinner tables, the language of power disguised as opportunity. How much are we talking? I asked. He named a number so large it should have made my pulse race. Instead, a wave of cold clarity washed over me. It was everything I'd dreamed of, instantly monetized, the perfect prize. But selling meant turning Lumina into a footnote in Langford's history, just as my father had always tried to turn my achievements into footnotes in Harrison's. This wasn't just an offer. It was another man trying to take what I'd built and call it his. I'll need to think about it, I said. Of course, Michael replied smoothly. But don't take too long. There are other players circling. If you join us, you won't just be in Forbes, you'll own the front page for a decade. I left the building with his words echoing in my head. Outside snow was falling again. I pulled out my phone and called Nora. Can you set up a meeting with the legal team tomorrow? She hesitated. You're not actually considering selling, are you? I'm considering every move, I said. And this one feels like chess. That night I sat in my apartment with a glass of wine and the contract draft Michael had already emailed me, pages of legal precision dressed up as praise. My laptop screen reflected the city lights as I scrolled through the clauses. Somewhere between intellectual property retention and executive authority, I realized what this really was. They didn't want Lumina. They wanted control over me. I closed the document. When the phone rang, I didn't check the caller ID before answering. Emma, my father's voice said. We need to talk. I almost laughed. That seems to be everyone's favorite line lately. I saw the Langford announcement, he said. They're trying to buy you out, aren't they? Word travels fast. I still have contacts, he said. Listen, don't take that deal. They'll gut your company, make you a figurehead. I've seen it 100 times. Don't let them take your independence just because they flashed a big number. That's how they trap you. I stayed silent, taking in his words. This was Richard Harrison, the man who built an empire on calculated risk, giving me unfiltered advice that went against his own profit model. It was the first true piece of guidance he'd ever offered. Why do you care? I asked finally. Because I've been where you are, he said. I know what happens when you trust the wrong people. Funny, I said softly. I used to think you were the wrong person. He didn't argue. If you walk away from this deal, you'll need leverage, he said. Something that reminds them you can't be replaced. I almost smiled. I already have that. The next morning, Lumina's team gathered in the conference room. I stood at the head of the table. We're not selling, I said simply. Nora grinned. I was hoping you'd say that. But we are expanding, I continued. Langford wants control. Fine. Let's give them competition instead. Within hours, my marketing director drafted the press release. Lumina Systems announces expansion into direct real estate technology solutions, independent from all existing partnerships. By noon, the statement was live. An hour later, Michael Langford called. Emma, he began, his tone tight. I thought we had an understanding. We do, I said. You understand your business depends on mine. I understand I like it that way. He was silent for a moment. You just made yourself a very powerful enemy. I prefer the word visible, I said. But thank you. I ended the call before he could respond. The days immediately following my rejection of Langford's buyout offer were a vacuum of silence swiftly followed by a storm of activity. My initial fear was that Langford would immediately initiate legal action. But their first move was subtler. They deployed whispers into the financial ecosystem. The narrative wasn't that Lumina was difficult. It was that Lumina's CEO was erratic, sacrificing billions for an ego project. My senior team gathered in our glass conference room looked shaken. We had signed new, smaller contracts, but the air was thick with unease. "They're saying we committed economic suicide," Nora stated, scrolling through a financial forum. The board members of 5 major construction firms, most of whom subcontract with Harrison Homeworks, are suddenly asking questions about our long-term viability. I leaned against the whiteboard, crossing my arms. "They're not questioning our viability, Nora. They're questioning my authority to command that much power without an established corporate father figure." My legal counsel, David, pushed a stack of papers forward. "The real issue is that their subcontractors are nervous about relying on a small company, even if it is powering them. They see Langford as stability. We need to counter that perception with a concrete move, not just a press release." I nodded, tapping my fingers lightly on the glass. "Then let's give them a concrete move. Who is Langford's biggest direct competitor in Denver that relies heavily on subcontractors?" David raised an eyebrow. "Apex Development. But their systems are archaic. They would need a full integration." "Exactly. Their systems are slow, which means my father's business has never touched them. Apex is independent of the current mess. They need a total rewrite, and we have the architect ready." The next 48 hours were a blur of intense negotiation. I flew to Chicago to meet the Apex CEO, a woman named Vanessa, who had built her reputation fighting against the kind of old guard Michael Langford represented. When I walked into her office, she didn't mention Forbes or Langford. She just smiled. "You turned down a mountain of cash," Vanessa said, leaning back. "That takes guts, Emma. Or idiocy. Convince me it's the former." I didn't talk about algorithms. I talked about control. I explained that Lumina wasn't just selling software. We were selling proprietary autonomy. Langford wanted to own my vision. I walked away because the future of this industry isn't about one giant swallowing the rest. It's about connecting equals. Lumina makes everyone better, but nobody owns the core system but us. Vanessa stared at me for a long time. "Your father's firm is the main subcontractor for half the city. If I hire you, how long until Richard Harrison tries to control my logistics because his daughter is running the tech?" That question, the one that defined my entire childhood, finally served as my greatest tool. "Harrison Homeworks runs on Lumina's code, and my father didn't know it for 6 months," I replied, meeting her gaze steadily. "That should tell you everything you need to know about our data integrity and independence." We signed the contract that evening. Apex Development became Lumina's first major client, acquired through proactive market disruption, not through inherited connections. The news hit the wire before my plane landed back in Denver. Lumina Systems snaps up Langford competitor citing innovative empowerment model. This was more than PR. This was a statement written in market capitalization. I was using my knowledge of the old guard's weaknesses, their dependency on reputation, and their fear of true independent innovation to build a system where my name, Emma Harrison, was the only required signature. Langford's attempt to isolate me had only forced me to accelerate my empire building. The moment that news broke, I knew Langford's next move wouldn't be subtle. It would be war. Power has a way of waking up enemies you didn't even know were asleep. Within 48 hours of Lumina announcing our expansion, the temperature of the industry shifted. Articles that once praised me started to use words like ambitious, aggressive, and uncompromising. Old colleagues resurfaced with sudden concerns. Anonymous sources whispered about a CEO with something to prove. It was a strange kind of revenge watching the same people who'd ignored me for years now scramble to frame my success as arrogance. The higher you climb, the louder the echo of those who want you to fall. The first real hit came from Langford. On Monday morning, our legal team received a notice Langford Interiors was reviewing the terms of our data usage agreement. Corporate speak for, "We're going to make your life hell." I gathered my senior team in the conference room. The snow outside reflected on the glass walls, making the room glow cold and bright. "They're retaliating," Nora said, flipping through the documents. "They're claiming our software is restricting their access to proprietary data." "That's ridiculous," our legal counsel muttered. "They approved those protocols themselves." "They're trying to scare us," I said. "Let them. This isn't the first time someone tried to make me small. It won't work now." We drafted our response before lunch, firm, factual, unapologetic. No concessions. No fear. That night, the industry blog Builders Journal ran a headline, "Langford CEO says tech disruption threatens construction stability." The accompanying photo showed Michael Langford at a podium, his expression somber, almost paternal. Beneath the article, his quote glared in bold, "Technology has its place, but when innovation becomes ego, the entire ecosystem suffers." My name wasn't mentioned, but it didn't need to be. He was trying to paint me as reckless. The next morning, I arrived at Lumina early. The building was still quiet. The phone rang. "Emma." It was Mom's voice, small and hesitant. "Your father's worried. He says the papers are calling you hostile. What's going on?" I smiled faintly. "Just business, Mom. Richard says Langford's a powerful man. You should be careful." "I am," I said. "That's why he's worried." There was silence on the line before she whispered, "You sound just like him when you say things like that." Later that afternoon, Nora burst into my office, tablet in hand. "You need to see this. Langford considers legal action against Lumina Systems. They're claiming breach of confidentiality," she said. "They want to audit our systems." "They can't," I said. "That would give them access to proprietary code." "Exactly." I rubbed my temples. "He's not just trying to undermine us, he's trying to own us through fear." "Should we fight it?" Nora asked. I met her eyes. "No, we lead it." That evening, Lumina's official account posted a statement across every platform. "Innovation is not ego. It's evolution. We build systems that empower, not control. We stand for transparency, equality, and the future of intelligent design." The statement went viral overnight. Hashtags formed. Stand with Lumia. Hatch innovation. Over intimidation. By the end of the week, Langford's PR machine was struggling to keep up. Then on Friday, something unexpected happened. My father called again. "Emma," he began, his voice softer this time. "I read your statement." "Did you?" I said. "You handled it well. Better than I would have." "That's because I didn't build my success on threats," I replied. He sighed. "I know what Langford's doing. He tried similar tactics with me years ago. The difference is I didn't cave," I said. He paused, then said quietly, "You're right, you didn't. If you ever need an ally, I'm here." For a long time, neither of us spoke. The silence between us wasn't heavy anymore. It was alive, uncertain, maybe even respectful. When the call ended, I stared at my phone. For years, I'd wanted him to see me. Now maybe he finally did. The next morning, Forbes reached out again, this time for a feature titled, "The Woman Who Took on an Empire." I read the subject line twice before closing the email. Because this wasn't about empires anymore. It was about survival and what happens when the people who underestimated you realize you're not just visible anymore. You're unstoppable. It's strange how power feels quieter when you finally own it. The noise of validation fades, and all that's left is clarity. A week after the Langford backlash peaked, the storm began to settle, but not in their favor. Their investors were spooked. Clients were calling Lumina directly. Still, I knew the reckoning wasn't over. There was one conversation left unfinished, one I couldn't avoid forever. My father had asked to meet in person. "Dinner," he'd said over the phone. "No press, no partners. Just us." We met at a small restaurant downtown. When I arrived, he was already there, seated by the window. He looked older than I remembered, or maybe for the first time I was seeing him without the armor of authority. "Emma," he said as I sat down, "you look different." "Success does that," I said lightly. He half smiled. "You've had quite a year." "So have you." A waiter appeared, poured wine neither of us touched. He cleared his throat. "I owe you an apology." The words hung between us, fragile as glass. "For what exactly?" I asked. "For underestimating you," he said slowly. "For making you feel like you had to earn my respect through blood and business." I stared at him, unsure whether to believe it. "It wasn't just an underestimation, Dad. It was erased. Every achievement I had was treated like a footnote in your story." He nodded. "You're right. And the truth is, I didn't understand your world. Code systems, algorithms. It all sounded abstract to me. I built things you could touch. Houses, bridges, towers. I thought that made them more real." "It made them temporary," I said quietly. "The things you build decay. The things I build evolve." That silenced him. Finally, he said, "I read everything about Lumina. You built something remarkable. I'm proud of you." It was the first time I'd ever heard him say it. "Pride doesn't erase what you said," I replied, "or how you made me feel." "I know," he said softly, "but it's a start." We ate in near silence. Halfway through the meal, he said I talked to Langford. My fork paused midair. "And he's stepping down. The board forced him out after the PR disaster. They're asking if you'll consider taking over the tech division he built with your software." I let out a small, incredulous laugh. "They want me to replace him," he nodded. "Seems like poetic justice. Seems like too little too late." He smiled faintly. "You sound like your mother." "She was always the wise one," I said. He studied me, then really studied me. "You've changed. You don't carry your ambition like a weapon anymore." "Because I don't need to," I said. "I'm not fighting for a seat at your table." He nodded slowly. "You built your own, and I made sure there's room for people who were never invited to one." For the first time, his expression softened into something that looked like respect. "I don't know if I deserve forgiveness," he said finally. "Forgiveness isn't the point," I replied. "Understanding is." He leaned back, exhaling. "You know your grandfather used to say legacy is what outlives our mistakes. Maybe you're the legacy I didn't know I needed." As we left the restaurant, the night was cold but clear. We stepped onto the paved sidewalk, the streetlights casting long shadows at our feet. The sudden release of tension made me want to breathe the open air. I suggested a short walk. He nodded, and for the first time in years we walked side by side, without the rigid formality of rank or achievement. I looked up at the towering skyscrapers where electric billboards flashed constantly. "This world is always moving, Dad," I said. "That's what concrete and steel can't do." "And you found a way to control that movement," he replied, his voice containing a new sense of acknowledgement. He wasn't looking at what I'd missed out on, but at what I had built. We stopped by my car. "Emma," he said finally, "I'd like to learn more about what you do. About Lumina. Maybe visit the office sometime." I smiled faintly. "You'd have to sit in the waiting room like everyone else." He laughed softly. "Fair enough." I drove away, watching the city lights blur through the glass. The victory felt quiet, not loud. It wasn't a triumph over him. It was an independence from him. I glanced in the mirror and saw him still standing there, hands in his coat pockets, watching me leave. Not with disappointment, but with something closer to peace. When I got home, Nora had left a voicemail. "Big news," she said. "Langford's board wants to publicly apologize. They're offering a new deal under your terms this time. Total control." I looked at the framed Forbes cover on my desk, and then out the window at the city skyline. Control. The one thing I'd chased all my life. And now I have it. But for the first time, I didn't need to use it as a weapon. I opened my laptop, drafted my reply, and smiled as I typed the final line. "Power isn't about who signs the contract. It's about who writes it." The morning sunlight hit the glass walls of Lumina like a spotlight. It was one of those rare Denver days when winter looked almost forgiving. But inside my office, the air felt electric. On my desk lay a contract that could rewrite everything. Langford Enterprises' proposal for partnership under exclusive terms by Lumina Systems. A year ago, they wouldn't even take my calls. Now they were asking to sit at my table, and this time I got to choose where they sat. Nora leaned against the doorframe, coffee in hand. "You're really doing this, aren't you?" I nodded. "We set the terms. They accept or walk." She smiled. "That's a hell of a turnaround." "It's not a turnaround," I said, eyes on the contract. "It's a full circle." By noon, the Langford board delegation arrived at Lumina HQ. When Michael Langford walked in, he wasn't the same man who'd once offered to buy me out. He looked smaller somehow, deflated. The swagger was gone, replaced by a humility that almost seemed rehearsed. "Emma," he greeted, extending a hand. "Thank you for seeing us." I shook it, polite but cool. "You're here because transparency is one of Lumina's founding values. I wanted to give you the courtesy you didn't give me." He nodded. "I deserve that." We sat. My legal team joined quietly. Michael cleared his throat. "The board recognizes the missteps that occurred during our previous collaboration. The company wishes to move forward under new terms, your terms." I slid the contract toward him. "Then let's review, clause by clause." I read it aloud. Lumina retained full ownership of its technology. All integrations would be managed independently. Langford could license access, but never alter, replicate, or claim credit. Michael's lawyer frowned. "This is highly restrictive." "Exactly," I said. "Lumina builds systems, not dependencies." Michael hesitated, eyes flicking over the final page. "And this last section, profit redistribution, you're asking for a 10% equity stake in Langford?" I met his gaze. 10% is the price of stability. Your investors lost confidence because you made a power play instead of a partnership. This is how you buy it back." For a long moment, he didn't speak. Then slowly he said, "You've changed." I smiled slightly. "No, I just stopped apologizing for who I've always been." Michael exhaled, nodded once, and signed. "Congratulations," I said, taking the document back. "You've just become Lumina's first client under our Empowerment First model." As they left, Nora slipped in with a grin that was half disbelief, half pride. "You just made a billion-dollar company bend to your blueprint." "Not bend," I said quietly. "Adapt." That afternoon, I called my father. He answered on the first ring. "Emma, Dad. I heard about the Langford deal," he said, voice steady. "You did good. Real good. Thanks." There was a pause before he added, "I saw the clause about equity redistribution. That's smart. Brutal, but smart. You really learned the business." "I learned it from watching how not to do it," I said softly. He chuckled under his breath. "Fair." Then after a moment, "Your mother and I are having a family dinner this weekend. No speeches, no headlines, just us. You think you could come?" Something in me loosened. "Yeah," I said quietly. "I'd like that." The next day, Lumina's PR department released a statement about the partnership. It went viral instantly. The headline read, "Emma Harrison rewrites the rules. The future of business is built, not bought." I felt centered. That evening, I walked the quiet halls of Lumina after everyone had gone home. Through the glass, I could see the city glittering below. I didn't need to inherit a legacy. I'd written one. Family dinners used to feel like performance reviews, cold, structured, full of silent calculations. But that night when I walked into my parents' house for the first Christmas since the Forbes cover, the air felt different, softer. The same house that once smelled like tension and disappointment now smelled like roasted rosemary and apple pie. My mother opened the door herself. "Emma," she said finally, "you made it." "I did," I said, handing her the bottle of wine I'd brought. This time I thought I'd actually sit at the table. She hesitated, then smiled through tears. "You always had a place here, honey. We just didn't know how to show it." The sound of laughter carried from the dining room. My father was there, standing beside the table. He turned when he heard me. "Welcome home," he said. The dining room was full, my brother Paul and his wife, my nieces, a few family friends I hadn't seen since childhood. At the far end of the table sat a chair I remembered too well, the one reserved for the kids. My father noticed where I was looking. "We kept your seat at the main table," he said quietly. "Right here." I smiled. Good, because I don't fit in that chair anymore. Dinner began awkwardly. My mother asked about Lumina and my nieces beamed. Paul, usually smug, looked down when I mentioned the Langford partnership. About halfway through, my father lifted his glass. I'd like to say something, he said. For years, he began. I thought success was about control, about keeping the family name strong, the business intact. But Emma. He turned toward me. You showed me something else. You built something that didn't just succeed. It inspired people. It made me realize that legacy isn't what we pass down. It's what we set free. My throat tightened. For the first time, I didn't feel like a child trying to prove her worth. I felt like an equal. When the glasses clinked and the conversation resumed, I leaned back and let myself absorb the noise. After dessert, I stepped outside for air. The backyard was blanketed in snow, the back door opened, and my father joined me, hands tucked in his coat pockets. Your mother's happy you're here, he said. I'm happy I came. He nodded toward the house. You know, I saw your interview last week. The one about leadership. Oh, you said something about power being stewardship, not dominance. I smiled faintly. I've learned that control isn't strength. Trust is. He nodded slowly. I spent most of my life not trusting anyone, not even my own kids. Maybe that's what I regret most. You can change that now. He chuckled softly. It's easier to rebuild a house than a family. Maybe I said, but both start with a foundation. I thought of my grandmother, the founder of the original family business, whose history Mom sometimes mentioned. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You've built yours well. We stood by my car. You already started, I said softly, referring to his efforts. When I went back inside, Mom was clearing plates. Stay, she said quickly when I reached to help. You're our guest tonight, I smiled. No, Mom. I'm not a guest. I'm family. Later, after everyone had gone to bed, I found myself in the living room. On the mantel, among old family photos, sat a new frame, the Forbes cover. For a moment, I thought about how far I'd come. I whispered into the quiet room, Merry Christmas, Dad. Merry Christmas, Mom. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. The fragile peace we found at the Christmas dinner table didn't extend to the sibling dynamic. Paul and I hadn't spoken since I left the house, but a week later, my phone rang with his name. I almost didn't answer. Emma, he said, his voice flat, drained of its usual champagne confidence. I need to meet you. It's not about Dad or Forbes. It's about work. We agreed to meet at a quiet coffee shop near the old downtown warehouse district. When he arrived, he looked haggard. He didn't order coffee. He just stirred the ice water in front of him. Langford's retaliating against everyone, Emma, Paul finally admitted. Even after Michael stepped down, they're making life difficult. They delayed a key shipment of prefabricated beams last week. It's not hurting Lumina. It's hurting us. It's hurting Dad's P&L. He paused, then sighed, running a hand through his hair. I tried to fix it using the old system, making calls, shifting inventory manually. I spent 3 days fighting phone trees and spreadsheets. I need to know how you fix things with Langford. I looked at him, surprised by his vulnerability. This wasn't the entitled heir. This was an exhausted man buried under a legacy he hadn't chosen. Lumina didn't fix Langford, Paul. Lumina made us independent of their chaos. My system predicted the delay 3 weeks out. Your team missed the alert because you weren't looking at the data. You were looking at the schedule. He pushed the glass away. I hate this, Emma. I hate the spreadsheets, the contractors, the sheer weight of knowing if I miss one number, I let Dad down. I never wanted this. I was good at the handshake, good at speeches. Dad always looked at me like I was the golden boy, and I ran with it. And you never looked back, I finished softly. I get it, Paul. I built my own world because I stopped waiting for Dad's applause. You stayed because you couldn't imagine life without it. I see now that your little project is the only thing keeping the whole empire afloat. He conceded the phrase, tasting like ash in his mouth. The irony is stunning. I didn't gloat. I can stabilize your inventory management system, Paul. I can train your team to use predictive analytics. Lumina can make sure you never miss a delay again. He looked up, hope flickering in his eyes. You would do that after everything? Yes, I said simply. But on one condition, you have to start building your own value, not just managing Dad's. You hate logistics. Find what you're good at. Sell the land, don't grade it. Use the charm, not the name. I explained how Lumina could isolate the supply chain functions he hated, freeing him to focus on client relations and acquisition the parts he genuinely enjoyed. We spent the next 2 hours mapping out a partial integration. When he left, he didn't offer a corporate handshake. He just squeezed my shoulder. Thanks, Em. Truly. As I watched him walk away, I realized the family narrative had changed permanently. It wasn't about who inherited the name, it was about who held the expertise. I hadn't just saved Harrison Homeworks. I had freed Paul to finally choose his own path, even if that path still led through the family business. It was a quieter, more profound victory than any Forbes headline could capture. The night before New Year's Eve, I stood in Lumina's top-floor office, the city below shimmering like a field of gold. A year ago, this view had felt like a finish line. Now it looked like a beginning. The real victory wasn't in what I'd built. It was in what I'd let go of the need to prove, to please, to perform. Downstairs, the Lumina team was celebrating our biggest year yet. Nora caught my eye through the glass and waved. I smiled and lifted my glass in return. I felt a quiet pride seeing them, knowing I had built a space where their expertise, not their last name, was the only currency that mattered. The elevator chimed, and footsteps echoed behind me. I figured I'd find you up here, my father said. Couldn't sleep, I said. Neither could I. He walked closer, his eyes tracing the skyline. You've done well, Emma. Better than I ever did. That's not true, I said softly. He chuckled. Oh, it is. I built a company. You built a future. We stood in silence for a while. I came to say thank you, he said finally, for letting me back in. I know I don't deserve it, but I want to earn it. You already started. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Your mother wanted you to have this. Inside was a gold pendant, a simple circle etched with 3 words. Build, lead, begin. It was your grandmother's, he said. She wore it when she opened her first bakery in Kansas City. The family business started with her, not me. Not even my father. Funny how we forget who really laid the foundation. I closed the box carefully. Thank you. When he left, I stood by the window a while longer, turning those words over in my mind. Build, lead, begin. The next morning at the quarterly meeting, I scanned their faces. A year ago, Lumina was fighting for legitimacy. Now we're defining it. But this isn't just about revenue or recognition, it's about responsibility, about creating something that outlives us. After the call, I sat alone in the quiet office. My father's words echoed softly, you built a future. I called Dad later that afternoon. I was thinking about our chat, I said. About the future. We're moving into sustainable architecture tech next quarter. Big focus on circular economies in Copenhagen and Toronto. Sustainable tech, he asked, a familiar skepticism creeping in. That sounds slow, Emma. Will that turn a profit fast enough? It builds a better foundation, Dad, I replied, my voice firm. Your business relies on materials that are finite. Your buildings last 50 years. My code helps build systems that ensure they last a century. I'm not building with concrete and steel. I'm building with enduring design and ethics. That's the real legacy. There was a long silence, then a heavy sigh tinged with respect. I see. You are right. Keep building, Emma. That night, as fireworks painted the sky above Denver, I walked out onto the balcony, phone in hand. My inbox was already filled with congratulations, interviews, and partnership requests. But one message caught my eye, an email from a young woman named Elise. Subject line, you don't know me, but you changed my life. She wrote about watching the Forbes video how she'd started her own tech company after years of being told she wasn't leadership material. She'd just landed her first investor and signed off with, "Thank you for showing me that the kids' table was never where I belonged." I closed my laptop, tears stinging my eyes. Legacy. I realized isn't what people remember about you. It's what they become because of you. When midnight struck, I raised my glass not to revenge, not to victory, but to peace. To every woman who's ever been told to sit quietly, to wait her turn to settle for less. Because we're not waiting anymore. We're building. We're leading. And for every daughter who's been underestimated, there's a future waiting at the head of the table, her table shining in the light she built herself.